Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for another episode of UNESCO Talks. I'm your host, Gabby Menezes. Our guest today is Dr. Heïdi Sevestre, a renowned glaciologist and explorer. She has gone on numerous expeditions to study ice. She's here to chat with us about the impact of the melting glaciers and what it means for all of us. Heïdi, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Gabby. Pleasure to be here.
So my first question is, how did you become a glaciologist? It doesn't seem obvious studying ice as a profession.
I know, but it is a job, actually, and I'm so happy to have become one. I was born in the mountains. I was born in the French Alps, and from as long as I can remember, I've always been so passionate about these environments. When I was a kid, my parents signed me up to that local hiking club just to keep me busy. And on one of these long hikes, I met this incredible mountain guide from Switzerland, Hubert Creton, that was his name. And I was a teenager at the time, and Hubert told me, it's pretty hard to be a mountain guide, the responsibilities and everything, but there are these other people, these scientists who get paid to study ice. And they're called glaciologists. And I was like, my gosh, are you kidding me? Like, this is really what I would like to do. This was, for me, my biggest excuse to be in the mountains. At the time, I was just fascinated with the idea of being in the mountains. But now I understand that being a glaciologist is just so much more than this. It's not just hiking around and taking beautiful pictures of glaciers. It's a huge responsibility because of everything that's happening to our glaciers.
And maybe you can talk about that. Our glaciers are melting. Science has sort of come up with how quickly they're melting. Would you be able to talk more about how quickly this is happening?
Yeah, glaciers are very simple things. They respond to changes in precipitation. So they love snow. The more snow they have, the bigger they can get. And they love the cold. At the moment, as you can imagine, because of the amount of fossil fuels we burn, the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, both the amount of precipitation, but the style of precipitation can change, but also temperatures are really rapidly increasing, especially in mountain regions. So glaciers are responding to this. They are some of our best barometers of climate changes, but across the world at the moment, glaciers are receding extremely rapidly. Actually, there's just been a study published on this a few weeks ago, and the study said that mountain glaciers are melting so much today that they could literally fill up Olympic-sized swimming pools, 3 of them, every second. Since 2000, glaciers around the world have lost about 5% of their volume. Doesn't sound like much, 5%, right? But it depends on the region you're looking at. For example, Central Europe. This is where I come from, where I was born. The glaciers I really deeply care about. Since 2000, the glaciers in Central Europe have lost 40% of their volume. And the consequences are terrible. They're already felt by populations, by community, and they're impacting, everything we have built, everything we have developed. So glaciers do matter.
So maybe can you explain to us why they matter? Why should we care, especially if we live hundreds of miles away from glaciers?
This is a very fair point, especially, if you have never seen glaciers or if you don't think they're important in your daily life. Actually, they might very well be. We know that when mountain glaciers melt, eventually their water can contribute to sea level rise. And what is absolutely crazy about this is that actually mountain glaciers since 2000 have contributed more to sea level rise than our ice sheets, more than Greenland and more than Antarctica. So they can actually dramatically impact coastal cities, coastal regions around the world. Yesterday I had the chance to speak to people in West Africa, for example, and they might not know how important glaciers are, but they know what sea level rise is, and actually glaciers are so much closer to them than they might think. So sea level rise is a really big thing. The second point why glaciers matter so very much is because they are some of the best water towers we have on Earth. When glaciers melt, they release fresh water, and fresh water we know is one of the most precious things we have on Earth. Of course, it matters to communities that are directly downstream of these glaciers, but sometimes these glaciers can have an impact over hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away from the mountains. The water can be used for the production of hydroelectricity, for agriculture, obviously, but also for industry. In my very own country, in France, we actually have nuclear power plants connected to rivers that come down mountains, connected to glaciers. And so glaciers do matter for all these very reasons, and at the moment we're losing these precious resources.
And I know that you've travelled extensively to study glaciers. Maybe you could share with us some individual stories from communities who've been affected.
I think that's, to me, the most touching part about studying glaciers. You know, I deeply care about glaciers, but meeting the populations, the community that live around these mountains can be heartbreaking, actually. Maybe I'll tell you two stories. I've had the incredible chance of being invited to study the glaciers of Colombia. Colombia was never on my list. I didn't know there were glaciers in Colombia until just a few years ago, and I got contacted by this amazing citizen-led initiative called Cumbres Blancas Colombia. Marcela Fernandez is the head of Cumbres Blancas, and she sent me a message on Instagram. She just DM'd me and said, "I've just seen you in a Nat Geo documentary. I've realized there are glaciers in Colombia. Can you come and help us to shine a light on what's happening to our country?" Colombia is one of the most beautiful countries I've ever seen, and Colombia still has 70 small glaciers in their beautiful mountains. We call them tropical glaciers because they're straddling the equator. And the only reason why we still have glaciers in these mountains is because the mountains culminate at 4,500 meters high, so they're absolutely giant. And there I actually met this incredible person called Jorge Luis Ceballos. He is the only glaciologist in Colombia. Would you believe it? There is only one glaciologist in the entire country. So every month, Jorge has to hike up the mountains, measure the health of the glaciers, and come down. So he's the fittest person I've ever met. But he's also dedicated his entire life to studying these glaciers. You know, he's poured every ounce of energy, all his love and care into studying these glaciers. And there's one glacier in particular that he really cherishes. It's called the Colejaras Glacier. I'm sorry, my Spanish is terrible, but anyways, it's a glacier that is nested against the Santa Isabel volcano. And this glacier is actually world famous in our community because every month for 40 years, Jorge has been collecting data on Conejas. And so Jorge has taken this habit of sending me WhatsApp videos of the glacier every time he goes there. And what happened recently is that he sent me a beautiful panorama of the glacier, and the glacier was totally snow-covered, just magnificent, absolutely shining. And a month later, he went back to continue his measurements, and he collected the same video, and actually the glacier was gone. Literally from 1 month to the next, the glacier he loves so much, this glacier that is so important for observations, had disappeared. And I can't tell you how heartbreaking this was for all of us. I remember I don't cry very often, but I remember being so emotional about this. So we went back a few months later just to help Jorge move all the instruments to another glacier. And just talking to him, he was about to retire at the time. And as you can imagine, someone who is so dedicated had lost, what his whole life was about. And I think these stories are so important. We need to understand that the experts working on these glaciers, I'm lucky to be one of them, but are so dedicated and have so little support. So we need to continue to encourage, these observations because literal livelihoods depend upon them. I think it's such an important moment to highlight the importance of science, but science done hand in hand with local and indigenous communities. And this is what I'm lucky to be doing in my profession as a glaciologist. We are at a moment when science, especially science exerted in the field, is extremely important. We need to make sure that this science is accessible to all. And let's make the most of this incredible moment to have the UNESCO International Year for Glaciers Preservation leading on to a decade of action for cryospheric sciences. This is the best moment to tell the world about the importance of these incredible ecosystems. This is the best moment to bring together all the policymakers from around the world to be ambitious about how can we preserve these environments, and most importantly, how can we help local communities face these changes and anticipate the consequences of climate change. So the time is now. Let's be ambitious. Let's get out of our silos. Let's bring everybody together and be extremely hopeful and be focused on the action around the cryosphere.
And once a glacier is gone, can it come back?
That's a very good question. So actually in the current climate, it is too warm for these glaciers to be able to regrow. In Colombia, not only the mountains are warming up very quickly, but there's also an issue of aerosols, of particles in the atmosphere. Some of them come from volcanoes that are active in the country, but also it comes from industrial activity. So the glaciers receive a lot of particles that make them darker and they melt even faster. At the moment, it would be impossible to regrow glaciers in the country of Colombia.
And so we've talked about the glaciologist, but what about stories from the actual communities?
Yeah, absolutely. Communities, what I really profoundly connect with when I meet with communities living around these glaciers is that for some of them, they have spiritual connections to these glaciers. For example, in Colombia, the Kogis population, they believe that glaciers are the brain of nature, which is, I think, so incredibly poetic, but they really understand that glaciers are important. Recently, I had the chance to travel to the Rwenzori Mountains National Park in Uganda. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as you know. And we worked hand in hand with Uganda Wildlife Authority and the local communities there. There is this incredible population called the Bakwanzo people. We wouldn't be able to do any work on the glaciers of the Rwenzori Mountains without these communities. And I learned so much from them. They told me that for them, their god, Kita Samba, lives in the glaciers. So understand, the deep connection they have with the ice. But they're also really scared of what's happening because they can see, they call this snow recession, they can see the glaciers receding. They are the real experts of these mountains, of course. And so for them, it is really scary, as you can imagine, to see that where their god lives is disappearing, and they're afraid that they're going to be, affected, that they're going to have a negative impact because the god will lose his residence. But also it's not just about spirituality, it's also about water resources, obviously. These communities are extremely vulnerable. Because they're so close to the mountain, not only they depend on the amount of water that they get, but also on the seasonality of water. In the tropics, you have very wet season. My gosh, in the Rwenzori Mountains, it can be extremely rainy. But during the dry seasons, they still rely on water coming from the glaciers. And what's happening right now is not just that the glaciers are important, but also that we need to help them to improve their water management systems. These are such vulnerable communities. A lot of the water is actually being lost, is actually being wasted. So not only we need to preserve water when there is water coming down from the mountains, but also they are facing another challenge that is very, very devastating. What they're suffering from is also massive floods in those regions, coming from not only glaciers melting, but most importantly from the amount of rain that can fall. As you know, climate change is impacting rainfall patterns. What they're seeing in the Rwenzoris is really dramatic rainfalls, creating crazy floods that can literally wash away entire villages. So we need to help them with early warning systems. We need to help them having access to the right observations and to the right forecast in order to be more resilient facing climate change.
And I guess part of that would be building infrastructure like dams, helping them to channel that water into a place where it could be stored.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a key element. We need to store water when water comes down from the mountains or when it rains from the sky. This is very important, very precious resources. Just to be ready in case during certain times of the years there is less water coming from the mountains. Making infrastructure more resilient is absolutely key. I've seen parts of villages being washed away. I've seen bridges destroyed. And these communities get so little help, right, to be able to rebuild, to be able to, just just to be there, just to stay in the villages, in the regions where their ancestors have lived for hundreds of years. And this is, where scientists also have to help out. We need to work hand in hand with these communities. We need to continue helping with capacity building. And the goal, for example, of the projects we're leading on the glaciers of Uganda is to basically help the communities to lead these monitoring programs. They go to these glaciers every month, so we need to give them the right tools, the right knowledge in order to continue this monitoring program and help them deal with the data to anticipate further changes.
And I wonder if we could speak a bit about the biodiversity around glaciers that is being lost. As you know, UNESCO does have the mandate to protect and safeguard biodiversity on the planet. So this is really related to a lot of the work that we do.
And in the Rwenzori, you have one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth. It's incredible because you're not only in the tropics, but you're in the tropics with glaciers nearby, so which is a really unusual setup. But this has really sparked a huge diversity of ecosystems, ranging from the foothills of the mountains to you almost feel like in the polar regions when you're at the top of the mountain. And so luckily, thanks to the rangers of Uganda Wildlife Authority, for example, they really opened my eyes to the amazing fauna and flora we've seen there. I couldn't recognize any of the trees, any of the plants, any of the animals. But this is also what we might lose if we see these glaciers disappear. This is also what might change, migrate, if climate change continues to happen at the speed at which it's happening at the moment. So biodiversity is absolutely key. And speaking to the guides, for example, working in the Rwenzori National Park, they are worried that climate change is going to impact this place so much that eventually tourists might not come anymore, because there is a little bit of tourism that is starting, and I recommend people to look at this beautiful place. It's just incredible. It's like no other places on Earth. But at the moment, they've told me they've noticed species shifting in altitude, one species invading the space of another one, creating certain conflicts. So absolutely, the biodiversity is also directly being impacted by climate change and by the loss of ice.
So I wondered if we could talk a little bit about your experience as an explorer and going to these very cold places to study ice. What is it like? What are some of the challenges that you face doing this?
I mean, first of all, I feel so privileged to be able to do this, right? I get to work in places where I don't meet a lot of other people, places that to me are the most beautiful places I've ever been. And you're right, it can be pretty challenging sometimes, but this is also what I like, to be able to see nature in its really raw state and to feel how powerful nature can actually be. And maybe I can tell you about one of the expeditions I've enjoyed the most. I mean, maybe enjoy is not the right term, but I've learned the most from. That was only a few years ago. I put together a team of incredible female glaciologists. We spent a month in the Arctic together on the archipelago of Svalbard, which is just between northern Norway and the North Pole. And this expedition was called Climate Sentinels, and for a month we basically skied across the archipelago. Why skiing? Because we wanted to decrease our carbon footprint. We also wanted to have an all-female expedition to show that we're here and this really matters. And also we wanted to collect data along the way on how air pollution can darken snow and ice surfaces and catalyze their melt. Because we were on skis for a month and sleeping in tents, we were extremely vulnerable. This was not the first time I had done something like this, but this time around, we faced the most horrendous conditions I've ever seen. We basically started the expedition in April, and April is usually one of the coldest months of the year, so it's usually -15, -20, but we love the cold because it keeps the snow hard, makes it easier to ski, it makes it a lot safer. And usually it's beautiful weather for a month. When we started the expedition, it started to be quite windy. It was +5 degrees. And I thought, wow, this shouldn't be like this, it shouldn't be so warm. And what happened is that for the first 2 weeks of the expedition, we got the worst storms I've ever experienced on the archipelago. It became so violent, so windy, that we got winds up to 140 kilometers per hour. And when the wind reaches these speeds, what happens is that actually the tents, like whether you're in the tent or not, the tent will fly away. So we had to make a decision. We were really fearing for our lives. And as a joke, I told my team just before the storm arrived, a few hours later, I told them the only thing that's left to do is to bury ourselves in the snow. And this is what we did, actually. We dug tunnels in the snow to be able to weather this cyclone that was happening around us. And so for 3 days, we stayed in those little tunnels. In the end, it was super nice. It was very comfortable. We were like digging little shelves and, beds and stuff. It was pretty simple, simple comfort, but it truly saved our lives. And this was truly the first time that I violently felt the power of climate change, or the consequences of, having this climate weirding, the weather becoming more unstable, becoming more violent. And by that point, I had already spent almost 15 years in the Arctic, so I knew what was happening. But to actually feel it and to fear for your life and the life of your team is definitely something different. And it shook me so much that from that very moment, I thought, from that point, every day, I'm going to tell people about what we've experienced and tell them how much the Arctic is responding to climate change. Everybody should know this. They should know that the Arctic is their present and their future. So being able to spend time in the field is not just being mesmerized by these environments. It's also some time to be on the front line of climate change and to directly, personally suffer from these consequences.
Paint me a picture. I struggle to imagine, but when we're talking about noticeable changes that you've seen across 15 years, how has the environment changed?
It's almost unrecognizable. Between now and the first time I traveled to the Arctic, it's heartbreaking to see how quickly changes are happening. I've seen glaciers lose hundreds of meters in length every year. Places we used to go to driving snowmobiles or taking our skis are unreachable now because glaciers have changed so much. In the village where I live on the archipelago of Svalbard, we've also had really dramatic consequences created by avalanches, for example. We've never had so much precipitation, we've never had so much snow because of climate change, which may be counterintuitive, but it is a direct impact of climate change. And there have been actually avalanches hitting our small village and actually killing people. So the changes are happening, from one year to another. Now this archipelago of Svalbard has become the fastest warming place on Earth, but I've also seen changes on mountain glaciers where I come from in the French Alps. The best example is perhaps Mer de Glace, which is our largest continental French glacier in the French Alps. And I have this very old picture of my great-grandmother actually standing on the glacier in 1916. She was wearing a beautiful Sunday dress, and this was a time when tourism was just starting in the French Alps. So they had just built a little train taking tourists up the mountains. And at the time you could take the train, walk a few steps, and you would be standing on the surface of the glacier. 100 years later, I went back to the glacier. I took the same train, except that in front of me was just a canyon that was 200 meters deep because the ice had receded so much. So it's incredible to see how quickly things are happening, and in some regions it's actually happening a lot faster than we expected. I just want to say that we need everyone to rally around mountain glaciers and around water resources. We can all do something about it, whether it's to try to save energy, try to use a little bit less, consume a little bit less, and also vote for climate leaders is very important. So we can all play a part. Every decision we make today will have a cumulative impact on the future. And it's not too late to save our mountain glaciers, but we cannot do this on our own. So let's rally up and let's fight for our glaciers.
Well, it's reassuring that there's still some hope and we can act on something. So thank you very much for that message.
Thank you, Gabby.
And thank you for joining us for UNESCO Talks. As always, please leave your comments and questions in the chat and we will get back to you. And join us for the next episode.